Good afternoon, I'm Lauren Sandler, and I'm really pleased to be here to introduce Pete Pannell and Rhonda Willer's talk about this fascinating material. I think, see, there's a lot of us here who are compelled by this material. I think of Terra Sigillata as something, I've been working with this for many years and still inspired and curious and often challenged, as I'm sure many of you are. And I think of the material, how it holds so much content and context, technique and materiality, and its vast history imbues the contemporary use with so many layers of narratives, of geographies, of aesthetics, and I think the alluring surface for many of us, like a skin revealing form, detail of mark, and evidence of touch. So Pete Pannell, I think for many of us, is such a continued resource with his endless technical and historic knowledge and his thoughtful and his beautiful objects. He was a studio potter for 12 years before joining the University of Nebraska in 1995, where he is still professor of art there. In addition to his teachings, Pete writes, lectures, and exhibits his pottery widely. His work has appeared throughout the US and in a number of venues overseas. And Rhonda Willer's, her poetic sculptural vessels, I think, speak of familiarity and mystery altogether. Rhonda earned her MFA from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln with post-bac studies at the University of Massachusetts at Dartmouth. Her ceramics education began at the University of Wisconsin-River Falls, where she earned her BFA in ceramics and photography. And since 2007, she has been a lecturer of art at the same university. Rhonda lives in rural Wisconsin with her husband and 3 children, and she is the author of several articles and of the forthcoming book, Terra Sigillata, Contemporary Techniques, which I'm sure she'll share with you today, which I'm really excited and looking forward to reading that and sharing that with my students. So please, if we can welcome, I think Pete is coming up first, and Rhonda will follow.
There's plenty of room up here, so if anybody's in the back and they want to see better, it's fine. Just come on forward. I'm just going to start. First, I'd like to thank Lauren Sandler for the nice introduction, my colleague Rhonda Willers for co-authoring this talk, and all the members of the NCECA staff and the NCECA board for the great work they do to make this event possible. I'm going to talk about the history of Terra Sigillata. I want to show you an example of Roman Terra Sigillata ware. Roman Terra Sigillata ware was a red earthenware, wheel-thrown and molded, and coated with a fine, polished clay coating. To understand Terra Sigillata, it's important to know what it is and what it isn't. Terra Sigillata is also known as Aretine ware, Samian ware, or just simply Roman red gloss pottery. Historically speaking, Terra Sigillata is a style of pottery and not a kind of pottery coating. However, the coating used on this pottery did share a technology with a great deal of the pottery made in the Greco-Roman world, which is why we currently use this term to describe it. Terra means earth. Sigillata means seal. However, the latter term is a bit confusing for English speakers because in English, the word seal has multiple meanings. This is not what we're talking about. These guys are sealing a driveway, but this isn't what we're talking about either. Seal, in this case, does not mean to make impervious to water. It actually refers to this. Picture it as a Roman seal that can be pressed into clay or wax and is used to either sign or close a document. This seal had a hole in it so it could be worn on a cord around the neck, and it is pictured here with a modern impression in clay. So this is what we're talking about. The definition is a device with a cut or raised emblem, symbol, or word used especially to certify a signature or authenticate a document. A medallion or ring face bearing such a device and size so that it can be impressed on wax or moist clay. Also, a piece of wax or wafer bearing such an impression. So this is a Roman signet ring, S-I-G-N-E-T. There's that prefix again. The Latin word sigillatus literally means adorned with small figures. You'll notice the tiny chariot racers on this seal. Similarly, the English word sigillate means to decorate with stamps. Anyone who has watched Game of Thrones knows that each house has a family sigil, which is the same Latin root word. Finally, the English words sign, signature, and insignia all have these same Latin roots. So this is Roman Terra Sigillata ware, and much of it was embossed, like the impression of a stamp, glossy like a wax seal, and it was often adorned with small figures. Terra Sigillata ware was first made in Italy, which was not always united as one country. This was how it was divided during the Etruscan era. And Arretium is located here. The term Aretine ware is derived from the name of this city. Terra Sigillata ware was very popular and was made everywhere the Romans went. Here is a map of just the known production centers in Western Europe. How widespread was the distribution of Terra Sigillata? This particular shard was unearthed in India. As I mentioned, much of Terra Sigillata was molded, and it could be either plain or decorated. Plaster of Paris hadn't been invented, so molds were made with bisque-fired clay. This one is signed from the workshop of P. Cornelius and was made in the 1st century BC. This detail shows how crisp and well-defined the image can be with a new mold. This bowl was made in Gaul, which is present-day France. Terra Sigillata pottery didn't just suddenly appear. It was the end result of about 6,000 years of technological development, and it's a very interesting story involving just about every corner of the Near East. There was an area within the ancient Near East known as the Fertile Crescent, which is where civilization first appears. The Neolithic, or New Stone Age, began in this area in about 10,000 BC. About 6400 BC, we began to see the third part of the Neolithic era, which is known as the Pottery Neolithic. In the northern part of the Fertile Crescent, this was known as the Halawa Culture, which begins about 6500 BC. This bowl demonstrates just how early in history potters mastered the use of clay-based finishes, mixing different clays and other ground minerals to ornament pottery. In the southern part of the Fertile Crescent was the Ubaid culture, which also produced some very beautiful pottery. Most of these early surfaces had a geometric basis and were done with skill and care. This large jar was made between 3700 and 3800 BC during the Chalcolithic era in central Iran. Potters had developed a black pigment from manganese and had moved beyond purely geometric patterns and were including abstracted animal forms in an implied three-dimensional space. The Egyptians employed a different technology to produce black-topped jars, this one from about 3200 BC. This was fired half buried in sand, so the top half could be smothered to produce this dark, black, carbon-based finish. This was different from the earlier work in that the black isn't made with a mineral pigment, but with carbon from a heavy reduction. This is an unfired cuneiform clay tablet. These first examples of writing were produced beginning about 3400 BC. This is Sumerian. At the same time and connected to that, cylinder seals began to be used as an administrative tool, a form of signature, as well as for jewelry. The seal is on the left, the modern impression is on the right. It's not surprising, then, that stamping began to be a way to ornament pottery. This Mesopotamian pot dates from between 2600 and 1950 BC. If you think about it, a stamp is just an incomplete press mold, which shows where molds began. The Minoans thrived on the island of Crete from about 2600 to about 1100 BC, and this beaked jug dates from about the midpoint. The Minoans developed sophisticated designs in multiple colors based on mineral pigments. The white in this came from a kaolinitic clay, the black from manganese, and the red-orange from iron. The Egyptians developed an innovative kind of white, artificial ceramic body that was based on ground quartz, not clay, and is now referred to as Egyptian faience. This body had a very low workability, so it made sense to press it into molds and then refine the molded surface by carving. This piece dates from between 775 and 653 BC. Meanwhile, the Greeks were going in a very different direction from a technological standpoint. This is an early proto-geometric style vase from between 1050 and 900 BC. You can see here that the black color is produced by using a very refined clay slip that was reduced during the firing to produce black iron oxide. In this case, the reduction was uneven, so parts of the pot remain in a red, oxidized state. It was this technology that the Greeks mastered to produce their phenomenal red figure and black figure ware. This is a scyphus, a type of Greek drinking vessel, and this early example is from about 625 BC. What we see here is the start of the use of both a red clay slip and a black clay slip on the same pots, and is an early example of what we now call Terra Sigillata coating. If you look at the photograph, the red and black areas are both more reflective than the surrounding tan background. Achieving the two colors in the same firing requires the use of two slips, one refined enough that it will reduce black and will be sintered to retain the color during reoxidation. The red slip is less refined and will reoxidize during cooling to produce the red color. This image shows a Greek potter firing an updraft kiln. Besides noting his lack of proper safety equipment, I try to get my students to not do this. You can see that the kiln is in reduction, which is why there are back pressure flames coming out of both the mouth of the firebox and the exit flue on top of the kiln. I'm assuming that the hook in his hand was for adjusting a damper that could control the flue opening on top of the kiln. This is from between 575 and 550 BC. This is an Attic black figure comast cup, K-O-M-A-S-T, made between 580 and 560 BC. By this time, Greek potters had completely mastered this surface technology and were producing consistent, refined results using the two colors along with several others. By the way, a comast was a kind of ritualistic drunken procession performed by revelers in ancient Greece. I'm using this as my example of Greek black figure wear because images of the comast always remind me of the Ensika dance. There is a technical term in physics that can be used to describe the surfaces of these pieces, and that's birefringent, which means that the surface has two different refractive indices. That's a fancy way of saying that the black parts are glossier than the red parts. This is an example of red figure pottery, which followed black figure ware. The surfaces on red figure pottery were as close to flawless as any produced in ceramic history and required a highly developed technology, including production of the slip, application of the slip, firing, and cooling. This image, by the way, is of two schoolgirls. The one on the left is holding a pair of writing tablets and a stylus. The Phoenicians, pictured here in red, and the Greeks in blue, competed to extend their influence throughout the Mediterranean. Beginning in the 8th century BC, Greeks began migrating to southern Italy in large numbers, creating an area that became known as Magna Graecia. It was through these colonies that Greek technology and culture entered Italy, and this influence is clearly visible on Etruscan pottery. One style of Etruscan pottery was this all-black bucero ware. Bucero ware used a reduction black slip made from a high iron clay, like the Greek red figure ware. This cantharos, which is a wine cup, dates from between 650 and 600 BC. This Etruscan bucero goblet dates from between 575 and 550 BC. You can see that the bowl on top was produced in a mold and features a row of human figures. What's interesting is this black color was intended to attract a particular portion of the market. What they were doing with this ware was directly referencing Roman silver vessels, both in form and color. Unlike modern silver objects, which are usually made from sterling silver, ancient silver was closer to fine silver and was prone to rapid oxidation. The natural color of that silver was black, not warm gray, as we think of as the color of silver. Black pottery was made to imitate silver. Etruscan potters created some forms that didn't occur in Greece. This is a duck-shaped oskos, which is a pouring vessel for oil. There are a number of these unique vessels in existence, but I think this is the nicest example, and it's in the Louvre, if you ever want to go see it. It's one of my favorites, actually, to visit. It's from the 4th century BC. You can see that the Etruscans added other colors of slip besides the red and black to create a more polychromed palette. And this is an Etruscan bell crater that was made between 380 and 365 BC. A crater was used to mix wine with water before serving. It was considered low class in the Greco-Roman world to drink wine straight, so it was almost always mixed with water. You can see that the slip was painted on a bit too thin in part, so where it outlines the figures and is a bit thicker, it's sintered black in the firing, but where it was too thin, you can see the red body below the slip. Megarian ware followed red figure ware in Greece beginning in the 3rd century BC. Unlike black figure and red figure ware, Megarian ware was normally molded and heavily figured, like this piece. Bowls were common, and they usually did not have feet. These pieces were the direct predecessors of Italian Terra Sigillata ware and predated it by 1 to 2 centuries. This ware was predominantly produced in Greece and Asia Minor. Which brings us back to Terra Sigillata, which first appears in the 1st century BC. All of the technologies that I mentioned lead up to this ware. The clay bodies were smooth and refined, which made them remarkably durable considering the low temperature to which they were fired. In modern terms, it would be between about cone 08 and 06. The clay slip finish was smooth, glossy, and yes, it actually did seal the body to a remarkable degree. The surfaces were embellished with patterns and figures, interspersing abstract pattern with implied three-dimensional space. Much of the work was made in bisque-fired molds, and complex forms were assembled from multiple pieces. Finally, the firings were controlled in oxidation. This example is from between the years 1 and 10 AD. Terra Sigillata ware was popular with Romans of all classes and often was inspired by more expensive ware like this silver scyphus. This terracotta scyphus was made between 15 BC and 60 AD. The feet on Terra Sigillata ware tended to be nicely formed and detailed. Like the earlier Greek pottery, all aspects of this ware were designed in a thoughtful manner. Some of this ware was molded plain and then carved, which allows us to see just how smooth the clay body is, which was achieved by levigation, that is, mixing the clay to a slip and allowing it to settle in large ponds. After the coarse grains settle out when the gate is opened and the slip is allowed to flow into a lower pond where it is dried to a plastic state in the sun. This piece was made between 170 and 220 AD in East Gaul, which we would now call Germany. Terra Sigillata ware from different areas are often a slightly different color, which isn't surprising since the color was a reflection of the local red clay. This piece was made in the first quarter of the 1st century. You can occasionally find examples that became slightly reduced in the firing, which isn't surprising since they were using solid fuels. It's a tribute to their mastery of the process that you don't see a lot of examples like this. By the way, romantic scenes like these were popular with both silver and Terra Sigillata. This cup shows 4 different couples in amorous embrace, and the pattern is based on grapes and grapevines, an obvious reference to the wine that the couple will drink from this cup. A modialis is a one-handled Roman drinking vessel. With Terra Sigillata ware, the body was often molded and the handle applied afterwards. This one is about 6 inches tall and made between 5 and 40 AD. Not all Terra Sigillata pottery was decorated. This is a nice example of a throne and hand-built plate from the mid-2nd century AD. The large flat handles resemble those found on Roman silver and bronze serving dishes and trays. At the center of the plate is a stamp with the name of the maker, Sabinianus. I'm giving a call out to a potter from 2,000 years ago. Some work was decorated with raised slip drawings. This ware is now called barbotine. This example is from the late 2nd century AD. After the 2nd century, Terra Sigillata ware began to go out of style and production ceased slowly throughout most of the empire. The last area in which it was made were the African colonies. Between the end of the 1st century and the beginning of the 7th century, popular red ware continued to be made in North Africa in what is now Tunisia and exported as far away as Britain and Roman Europe. This is African slipware from about the 4th century AD. Throughout most of the Roman Empire, Terra Sigillata production was replaced by glassware and lead glazed pottery, like this cup made in West Gaul in the 3rd century AD. Examples of ancient Greek and Roman pottery began to reappear as early as the medieval period, being found when people were digging basements or wells, or when tombs were accidentally found. It was a source of wonder during the Renaissance when people marveled at the quality of these remarkable pots and wondered about the beautiful surfaces. This is a portrait of Anne Claude Cayus, who lived between 1692 and 1765, and was a remarkable scholar and antiquarian. He was one of the first to attempt an in-depth study of ancient pottery of the classic world. These same pieces fascinated and shaped popular culture. Josiah Wedgwood produced work that was heavily influenced by these ancient Greek and Roman pots. This teapot was made by Wedgwood in the late 1700s out of a clay body that was intended to capture the look of the Roman bucero ware, and with classical scenes that were inspired by Greek pots and embossed by Roman Terra Sigillata. The next major step in the rediscovery was by this man, Dr. Samuel Birch, who had a great title, the Keeper of Oriental Antiquities at the British Museum. In 1858, he wrote the first complete and exhaustive history of ancient Near Eastern pottery. In it, he described the difficult scientists had trying to understand the coating that they found on these ancient pots. Considerable difference of opinion exists with respect to the varnish of these vases. By some, it is stated to be an alkaline glaze, by others, a glaze of a metallic nature, while water alone is said to be sufficient to produce the polish. In 1908, H.B. Walters updated Samuel Birch's masterwork, adding new historical information. However, on one topic, there was still a great deal of misunderstanding. Formerly, it was thought that the red glaze was obtained in the baking after careful polishing of the surface, and that special means were adopted to this end. But in the Terra Sigillata, the red glaze reaches a high and uniform state of perfection. This seems to have been produced by a kind of varnish, the elements of which are not absolutely certain, but it would appear that the substance added to produce the effect was of an essentially alkaloid nature. Besides investigating surfaces, there was a great deal of study done on all aspects of Terra Sigillata pottery. This is Hans Dragendorf, a late 19th century German scholar who created a classification system for the forms of Terra Sigillata ware. So now the form of each style of pot can be described by its Dragendorf number. Often, when you see the image of a Terra Sigillata piece in a museum, it will say something like DR32. This is a reference to a particular shape identified by Dragendorf. Here's a page showing the kinds of drawings that he did for each form. By the way, these diagrams can be a great source of pottery vocabulary for student potters. In 1908, a magazine called The Antiquary published an interesting little tidbit, a short article in its news section, which stated, "For a long time, potters have made efforts to rediscover the method by which the Romans imparted that beautiful velvety luster to what is known as the Terra Sigillata ware. It is now claimed that Mr. Carl Fischer of the art pottery, Sulzbach, Oberpfalz, Bavaria, has discovered, if not the identical Roman process itself, yet something which gives practically the same rich and lasting effect. It is nothing more or less than the application of engobage in a liquid state to pottery in a biscuit condition. The engobage sinks into the clay and is then polished, just in the way that boots are polished with patent blacking." In the same year, the American publication Clay Record also mentions this news. A new glaze produced. The new glaze, invented by Carl Fischer of Sulzbach, Upper Bavaria, is said to reproduce the beautiful velvety gloss which has made notable certain Roman ware. It has been supposed that the ancient workmen used a fusible glaze containing lead, boric acid, silica, etc., but experiments with these materials have given no satisfactory results. A clay sludge is applied by Mr. Fischer to the ware after the first baking. The surface is polished, the ware being fired, and the long-sought gloss is brought out. Interesting work with the new process will be done at the German Emperor's private pottery. By the way, I think we should add the words engobage and sludge to our ceramic glossaries. Anyone who went to Alfred will recognize this person as Charles Fergus Binns, first director of the New York State School of Clayworking and Ceramics at Alfred. In 1929, Binns, along with A.D. Fraser, published an overview of the research leading up to that time, along with the results of testing that had been done at Alfred. Binns and Fraser proved that it was the use of oxidation and reduction that produced the colors of the ancient Greek red and black ware. They were provided with shards by the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and they were able to alternately oxidize and reduce the shards, proving that the red and black colors of the Greek pottery were produced by iron in two different states, oxidized and reduced. It was a German scientist, Dr. Theodor Schumann, who put the final puzzle pieces in place. It's remarkable that he did this research in Germany in the midst of the Second World War, and that it was published in 1942. First, he describes, "It is revealed that a film of exceptionally fine clay tends to shine, and also that the secret probably lay in such an application." But then he talks about the difficulty of separating out the fine clay particles. And he said this difficulty must be explained by the tendency of clay particles to coagulate and form larger complexes as a result of their inherent magnetic quality. Of course, we know that as flocculation. These particles can only be separated and the microscopic lumps of clay fundamentally resolved by pursuing the methods of colloid chemistry by a process known as peptization. Such a process is initiated by adding to the carefully sifted clay an alkaline solution, such as potassium carbonate. The clay is made into a thin porridge and left to stand. The longer the mixture is permitted to stand, the finer the glaze will be. So there he's talking about deflocculation and settling. It is now established that no pigment was needed, but that the color differentiation was produced entirely by the action of firing on the clay. The Greeks subjected the vases decorated by means of the gluey colloid first to an oxidizing fire, thereupon to a reducing fire, and finally left them to cool down under oxidizing conditions. With that, Schumann finally completed a 200-year-long process to understand these ancient finishes. However, what he didn't explain is how artists would use these ideas today. And my colleague, Rhonda Willers, is here to explain that half of the story. By the way, we'll save questions to the end, and we'll answer questions together. Thank you.
There it goes. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Pete, for that great introduction. Born in Philadelphia in 1920, Joseph Veach Noble began collecting Greek vases and became a self-trained ceramic archaeologist. He worked as an operating administrator for the Metropolitan Museum of Art from 1956 to 1967 and continued an active role in museum administration. In 1965, Veach Noble published his books, The Technique of Painted Attic Pottery, in which he described the process of recreating Terra Sigillatas. He was the first person to publish an attempt to recreate the Terra Sigillata in order to understand what the surface of these beloved forms really was. Prior to this, and still today, the Terra Sigillata surfaces were and often are referred to as clay slips, slip paint, or paint in the museum and research settings. Veach Noble's work was republished in 1988. His book provided a foundation for modern ceramic artists to explore and recreate Terra Sigillatas for their works. In the 1970s, Betty Woodman became the first contemporary American artist to make extensive use of Terra Sigillata. Betty's expressive earthenware, which was informed by Mediterranean pottery, first integrated basic red-orange Terra Sigillata and then expanded into dynamic red-orange, white, and black patterned surfaces. She continued this through the early 2000s, and always stretching the limits, she employed her painterly techniques, using unfired Terra Sigillata in her works on paper. She layered these Terra Sigillatas with acrylic paints, graphite, ink, and wax. And in her more recent works, we see her integrating and going back to the red, black, red, orange, and black and white, along with her vibrant colors. In the teaching of Terra Sigillata, Pete Pannell has been a leader in America. His easy methods of making Terra Sigillatas were first written down and distributed by Linda Arbuckle after a joint workshop. And these have been shared through countless photocopies, oral stories, and online resources, as many of you know. Credited by numerous artists as being the inspiration and the foundation of their Terra Sigillata use, Pete has surfaced his earthenware and soda-fired works with Terra Sigillata since the early 1990s. His use of patinas, which is a metal oxide and flux, enriched the textured surfaces of his forms. As an aficionado of Greek attic pottery, he has created illite clay-based Terra Sigillatas that closely mimic the classical ware. A former graduate student of Pete Pannell's, Meredith Brickell's work demonstrates the poetic eloquence that Terra Sigillata represents. Her minimalist forms and pure white Grolic kaolin-based Terra Sigillata highlight the subtle marks of her making process. Sam Gibish collects wild clays from around the world. From these clays, he creates Terra Sigillatas, each resulting in a unique color that is a representation of the location from which it came. Sam layers one color on top of another, firing each to a slightly higher temperature. The final firing for each piece is in a gas or wood kiln where the previously non-vitrified Terra Sigillata becomes carbonized. Drawing from his Pueblo culture of Cochiti, Virgil Ortiz's clothing, textile, and pottery designs express the deep-rooted traditions of Terra Sigillata in the American Southwest. The Blind Archers series of clothing, ceramic vessels, and sculptures pay tribute to the matriarchal traditions of perseverance and leadership. Through Virgil's elaborate geometric patterning, we see the Terra Sigillata enlivened forms based on the traditional Cochiti figures. His contemporary expressions simultaneously pay homage to the past and propel us into the future. Creating places of rest within her multi-patterned layered surfaces, Margaret Hayden uses base Terra Sigillata colors to create negative shapes within her coil-built forms. The simple red-orange color creates space for our minds to complete the pattern or rest. The uniqueness of these negative shapes alludes to an enlarged version of the microscopically detailed areas. Also working with base Terra Sigillata colors and blended base Terra Sigillata colors of Cedar Heights red art and Newman red clay, Minnesota artist Lisa Buck draws attention to the textural qualities of her working method. The singular Terra Sigillata color used on carved brick basket emphasizes the overall form and its relationship, while encouraging us to notice the energetic repetition of the zigzag perimeter. Investigating cultural narratives and questions of truth, of memory, and our perspectives through the language of the vessel, Lauren Sandler references historical forms while tying the works to the present through her textures. The skin-like covering of Terra Sigillata maintains the essence of raw clay and accentuates the pinched surfaces of Lauren's forms. Also attracted to the subtle skin-like coating Terra Sigillata provides, Joanna Poeg's sculptural installations of repetitive forms, which are designed using Adobe Illustrator, require one quick coating of Terra Sigillata be applied via brush. Her delicate components are fired to cone 04 with a slight reduction in a gas kiln. Terra Sigillata's capacity to react to flame within the firing process leaves another trace of history in her work. Having been exposed to Terra Sigillatas through a variety of teachers, both formal and informal, Adrienne Elitis eventually found them to be a perfect solution to providing a completed bottom surface for her functional forms, as well as creating a rich underpainting for her multi-layered patterns. The delicate line capturing ability of Terra Sigillata offers yet another solution for Adrienne's work. To create the variety of colors, she combines a simple XX Sager ball clay based Terra Sigillata with commercial stains, mixing them by volume. Drawn to the unmatched delicacy of line quality, David Eichelberger uses Terra Sigillata as a canvas to create carved fine line drawings on his earthenware forms. The narratives created through the minimal expression of color connect us to our often overlooked routine stories of life and imbue them with importance through their simplicity. Transitioning between glaze, bare clay, and Terra Sigillata, Courtney Murphy uses light blue Terra Sigillata as both a design element and a functional coating, providing a smooth, soft-like surface for the user's hand. An early workshop with Meredith Brickle provided a foundation for easy methods of making colored Terra Sigillatas with mason stains. Courtney makes use of distilled water to make her Terra Sigillata when the water quality is exceptionally hard, as the additional minerals affect the settling process. Inspired by aging architecture, Mark Arnold works with a broad palette of mason-stained base Terra Sigillata colors, layering them with underglaze and glaze, replicating ideas of imperfections and aging on his functional forms. The leather-hard stage of clay, which inspires his use of Terra Sigillata, as they most closely represent the malleable stage of the making process. Sgraffito and Terra Sigillata layers form the spirited surfaces of Rebecca Zwiebel. Taking a workshop with ceramic artist Carrie Radash inspired Rebecca to create Terra Sigillatas by mixing them in with Amico velvet underglazes to create unique colors. From there, she began layering Terra Sigillata with Sgraffito motifs and continues to layer both until the patterning is complete. A copper carbonate wash patina is applied and then wiped off prior to firing in an electric kiln. Enhancing the soft surface, a final wax layer is applied. Experimenting, recording, and fun, Carrie Radash has created a practice with Terra Sigillata that matches her interest and work style. As she describes it, I love the way my raincoat versus lab coat process allows me to be a cook when I am making my colors. At the heart of her practice, she is playful and intuitive, all the while remembering that good methodology and recording matters. As a former graduate student of Pete Pannell's, Carrie joyfully colored decorations making use of the historically desirable traits of Terra Sigillata and the contemporary potentials of delicate line work and earthy rich tones paired with inspired modern colors. Learning from Margaret Bowles at the University of Minnesota, Minneapolis, Liz Zott Summerfield came to Terra Sigillata as a means to stretch herself to try something new after having spent most of her time working with stoneware and atmospheric kilns. Her specialty utilitarian objects provide an exterior canvas for Terra Sigillatas with glazed interiors. While the work is leather hard, she slip trails creating raised textures, and at bone dry, she applies 3 coats of Terra Sigillata and then underglaze, and sgraffito marks are made. And finally, a clear glaze is brushed on using wax resist. Gunyun Kim's psychological, emotional, figurative sculptures are surfaced with color that subtly shifts at times, and at other times, strong, bold colors draw our attention to specific forms. Desiring a surface that was more suggestive of the human skin, Terra Sigillatas became Gunyun Kim's preferred solution over slips with their ability to maintain details. She begins with a base layer of white Terra Sigillata, followed by mason-stained colored Terra Sigillatas, after which the Terra Sigillata is burnished or polished with a soft plastic bag, such as a produce bag, while it's still moist. And after the bisque firing, she applies additional layers of underglaze and glaze, firing to cone 02. And finally, china paint and gold luster are added. For Casey Whittier, Terra Sigillata creates a unity between surface and form because of the shared clay material. Her installations and sculptural objects make use of the subtleties and unity that Terra Sigillata creates. In The Longest Flight, Casey applies, then scrapes off Terra Sigillata, creating a worn handle surface. In Case I Need You Again Someday incorporates Terra Sigillata on the swing seats, mimicking the black rubber, and demonstrating Terra Sigillata's versatility. The lock and chains reference an aged ghost-like object. Breaking Terra Sigillata rules, Mark Ferris often mixed his Terra Sigillata by eye, following the approximate 1 part clay to 2 parts water, more or less. After bisque firing his work, Mark applies a flux-containing low-temperature slip. Then he sprays on 3 layers of Terra Sigillata. The additional flux material in the slip allows the Terra Sigillata to stick on the bisque-fired work. And while he experiences some variation in color over time, potentially due to the difference in specific gravity, this is a variation he prefers to keep in his process. Similar to Mark, Noah Rydell works with flux additions to adhere layers of Terra Sigillata to his modern furniture-inspired ceramic forms. Initially, Noah used Terra Sigillata as a way to incorporate local clays into his work. His current work features richly colored and layered surfaces over abstracted forms that are enhanced by a surface application process, which involves spraying alternating layers of Terra Sigillata and layers of pure fluxes such as Ferrofrit 3134. Expanding the use of Terra Sigillatas, Joseph Pintz layers Terra Sigillatas with washes and materials to encourage greater variation on his hand-built surfaces. The Terra Sigillatas are layered and applied using wax, creating delicate, fine lines of varying colors. Mixing borax and water, Joseph applies thin wash layers after bisque firing to create an iron speckled look on the surface. The wash layer is fired to cone 03 approximately. Influenced by her childhood time spent in Nigeria and her childhood home of Israel, Vered Binyami's work, imagination, was cultivated by art objects created by the Yoruba tribe. Terra Sigillata provides a ceramic finish that does not hide the clay body, but instead reveals the dark clay beneath the surface, which has been hand-built and coiled in pinching methods. Vered uses very fine sandpaper to then soften the surfaces after they've been fired. Ronan Peterson's connection to comic books and painters such as Paul Klee and Juan Miro inform his color use, compositions, and ceramic forms. The waxy quality of Terra Sigillata and its reactive nature to microatmospheric conditions when layered with lithium and sodium-bearing glazes appeals to Ronan. His application method involves layering slips, Terra Sigillatas, and glazes with wax-resist patterning. Canadian sculptor and curator Xanthi Isbister layers Terra Sigillatas with washes on her earthenware, nature-driven sculptures. Earthy red-orange Terra Sigillata and textural washes pair with the stacked density created by the repetitive mass of clay. Borax and lithium-based washes highlight the shifts in directions and signify transitions that are both geological and metaphorical. Glacial-like plains are heightened by the waxy cool Terra Sigillata. Exploring race and racism through his figurative sculptures, Nathan Murray expresses physical and metaphorical subtleties through both the surfaces and details of the figure. Nathan begins by surfacing his work with Terra Sigillata as it preserves the most minute of textures, where even the glance of an eye or the arc of a brow is obscured by slip. After firing the Terra Sigillata on his figures, Nathan adds layers of colored acrylic paints that interact with the base Terra Sigillata layer. This progressive layering of materials results in beautiful, rich surfaces. In my own work, Terra Sigillata's ability to function across multiple firing ranges allows me to experiment with one surface material in a variety of kilns. Layering colored Terra Sigillatas, lithium, borax, soda, and salt washes in the electric kiln make for atmospheric-like effects at cone 04 and 03. Low-fire soda firing provides an overall semi-gloss sheen while darkening the Terra Sigillata's color. Glaze interactions with Terra Sigillatas, washes, and soda firing produces textural surfaces as well, with wide-ranging color results. In capitalizing on atmospheric conditions in the wood kiln, such as an Anagama or Nobori-gama-style wood kiln, Terra Sigillatas with their fine particle sizes flash and collect ash, creating contrasting colors. Kenyan-born British studio artist Magdalene Odundo's highly burnished surfaces expertly blend traditional methods of the ancient Greeks and Romans, Nigerian and Kenyan, and American Southwest traditions. Her coil-built form suggests the human body and containment while gesturing towards historical ceramic forms. Working with Terra Sigillata at Cone 1 gas reduction, Maggie Yazchak layers white Terra Sigillata and slip with glaze. These stony rich surfaces reveal dragged grog, finger marks, and faint pinkish halos of color. Grays matted out with thin glazed layers develop the low fire reduction firing. Applying a high specific gravity Terra Sigillata to the leather hard clay, Matt Kelleher creates a waxy leather surface in his Cone 3 soda-fired red clay. The thick layer of Terra Sigillata smooths over the picture form and records the firing atmosphere inside the kiln, flashing where the flame encounters the form. Playful, graphic markings are enhanced by an underpainting of earthy red Terra Sigillata in Dita Mert's Cone 5 electric functional forms. With the desire to create works that contain textural depth, Dita turned to Terra Sigillatas to capture her fingerprints and provide a rich base for other designs. Encouraging and enhancing fragility to explore temporal experiences, Amanda Salav uses Terra Sigillata as a means to heighten these sensations within her sculptural works. Working at Cone 6 and with porcelain, Amanda uses Terra Sigillata for its traditional skin-like corporal qualities through the brush application, and she also embraces perceived flaws of the material by dipping the sculptures into a very thick Terra Sigillata, creating a wrinkly, shrinky-like peeling surface. Spraying on colored Terra Sigillatas, Sarah Blitz creates carefully gradated color spectrums on her abstract lyrical forms. These graceful, mythical forms are enhanced and deepened in the Cone 8 electric firing. Using a process that mimics slip dipping, but with Terra Sigillata, Italian-born Australian artist Walter Auer creates work that he calls clay petrification. In this process, Walter uses the shell of a teddy bear form, filling it with stoneware clay, then dipping it in Terra Sigillata before firing it. Utilizing this process, he has collaborated with Aboriginal people of Australia to create clay petrified teddy bears and books that are decorated by the Quarry elders. Jerilyn Bearden combines Terra Sigillata, Glaze, Sandblasting, acrylic surfaces as a way to create the unexpectedly aged and vivid colors. Adopting perceived negatives about the surface, Jerilyn begins by spraying on black glaze, layered with black Terra Sigillata, then firing to Conal 4. After which, my Alka glaze is sprayed onto the fired surface, followed by a transparent green glaze, and once again fired to Conal 4. The piece is then sandblasted and sealed with acrylic. This multi-layered, multi-fired process stretches the potential of Terra Sigillata, encouraging further experimentation. And still today, we see Terra Sigillata's humble roots repeated, sealing cooking vessels, enchanting us with its potential beyond its initial development. Munchie is one such example, creating her works in the tradition of her mother, Ma Lu, in Jamaica. Each maker burnishing with a stone passed from one to the next and adding her own indentation to the horizontal line marks on the forms she creates. And while the application and use processes of Terra Sigillata continues, the method of making the Terra Sigillata remains relatively consistent, 1 part clay to 2 parts water, plus some deflocculant. Because the need of Terra Sigillata to make a form watertight is of lesser concern, contemporary ceramic artists use Terra Sigillata not out of need, but instead out of expression as seen today. The range of firing temperatures, opportunity for color variations, and textural developments making Terra Sigillata inviting and intriguing to all of us. For a more in-depth look at the processes and recipes and additional contemporary artists, consider checking out my book that will be ready in a couple months, and that will be available. And if you want to get in touch with Pete or I after this lecture, feel free to contact us through our methods that we have up above. And many of you in your hands might be holding a small pinch pot. My students at UW River Falls were incredibly generous with their time and made these pinch pots. And we surfaced them with a variety of colors that are maybe somewhat unexpected to an extent. They're all made with either a carbonate or an oxide primarily. And we just wanted you to be able to hold an object with the material on it while we spoke today about Terra Sigillata. Thank you. So if you have any questions, feel free to use the microphones, and Pete and I will be happy to answer.
Yeah, please speak into the microphone if you have a question so that it's recorded for the video.
Hi, guys.
Hi.
Hi.
So this is more of a background question. Can you talk about your research methods? I mean, you just went through like 50 artists, many of whom, you know, I'm sure like some of us know, but like they're a lot new to me. So can you talk about how you found those people and kind of cultivated that list?
Sure. I use social media, actually. I started there, and I looked for people hashtagging Terra Sigillata. So if you're working with it, hashtag it. It sounds really kind of contemporary and silly, but it actually works. So I started with that, and then I would go to that person's website, start to study who they were, look at the kind of work they were doing, what else they were doing, and try to kind of see where they fit in the scope of the making process and using process. So it truly started there. I also asked people like Pete and others for recommendations of people they knew. Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to make a comment. I think that it's important to recognize the contribution of the Nazcan culture, which I think had really, I think it's important to recognize the contribution of the Nazcan Peruvian culture, which had, you know, tremendous contribution in terms of the natural colors and oxides at a very early time, you know, from maybe 600 BCE to 200 CE.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. And one of the hard parts for me doing my part of the talk was to decide what to include and what not to include. So I included just the stream that led to Roman Terra Sigillata ware. But obviously this technology has been used all over the earth, in particular, as you say, in Mesoamerica. So yeah, if we had 4 hours instead of 1 hour, we would have included a lot more. Other
Hi.
comment? Oh, yes.
Can you talk a little bit about the information you know regarding layering terracage in between firings?
Sure. Well, Sam Gibbish, who's been here doing demonstrations, in my opinion, would be the expert on that in terms of layering at different temperature levels. So he will kind of source all his wild clays, make his separate sigillatas, puts a layer on, fires them just barely to temp. You were saying yesterday it was like 020 or something.
Yeah, about 020.
And then he'll put more on and then fire again, and he'll continue that process until he has as many layers as he wants on the work. So I would say that would be the person to talk to if you want to layer just Terra Sigillatas. A lot of the artists that I talked about and mentioned layer fluxes in between or add fluxes to their slips. So lithium carbonate, which is getting more expensive obviously to have right now, is a common flux that's added to slips though too, to help with that sticking process.
Terra Sigillatas are great to use as a layer before you put on a patina, which is just like a metal oxide in a flux, or a glaze. And because Terra Sig is so thin, I've seen people using it in really untraditional ways. For instance, putting a glaze on bisqueware and then putting a Terra Sigillata on the glaze, or putting a glaze, then a Terra Sig, and then another glaze. And so it's simply a layer, and it's a layer that can operate by itself, but it can also operate as a layer among many others. And I think that's what is fun about it, is that flexibility. I mean, every time I tell my undergraduates a rule about Terra Sig, they immediately break it and get great results.
Yeah, that's true.
So I've pretty much stopped telling them rules. Other questions?
You showed a pot that was black on the top and red on the bottom,
yes.
that was covered in sand, you said. Do you know if the floors of their kiln were sand?
Yes.
Or,
Yeah.
they were?
Yeah, that's what I've read. I've never seen the process in person or where they did it. But yeah, according to the archaeological records, they were burying the bottom half of it in sand and then smothering it, which of course is how like Southwest Native Americans made that beautiful carbon-based black, like Maria Martinez. So yeah, that's the process.
Hi.
Hi.
Is there any reason why you do not use the word burnish? I know that Malus Meggie, whose work you showed at Dundu, they do not use the word polish at all. They use the word burnish.
Burnish, right.
Is there any reason why you have not used it?
No, I just chose not to say it today. But yep, I remember the burnishing stone that she used when I went there on a workshop and met her, met Munchie at the time and bought that object from her. And I remember the way she burnished with that super smooth stone that had come from her mother.
Okay. Incidentally, she's from my own country, Jamaica.
Oh, fantastic.
So I work with her. So
Yay.
Oh, very good.
Oh,
thank you.
Awesome.
Thanks for coming. Yeah, that's an interesting point I think that we could touch on, is that burnishing and polishing are two different things.
Right.
And burnishing, it can be another layer all on its own, or a piece can be burnished and then Terra Sigillata can be put on it, and then the Terra Sigillata can be polished. Burnishing moves around the entire surface and changes the surface of the pot. Terra Sigillata doesn't do that, but it can be polished in and of itself. And so sometimes people confuse those terms, but they also work great together. I think our time is up. Oh, we have another question?
Just at least at a high level, could you maybe explain a little bit why the Sig would lose its gloss as you fire it higher and higher?
Oh, sure. So to begin with, the clays that we use are ilitic or kaolinitic, and they have flat platelets. And by levigating it, by letting the larger particles settle out, we're just left with the small flat platelets. And when you polish it, they lay flat. Beginning at about 1800 degrees, those platelets break up into other crystalline forms. And so that's why it begins to lose its gloss. Now, it'll still be there, and it'll still oftentimes be glossier than the regular clay surface just because the particles are so small. But the hotter it goes, the more those particles break down and take on other structures. It's basic. Thank you very much for coming, everyone.